Like an absolute coward, it's now time for me to go back on everything I said in my contrast versus traditional video. And that is of course a complete lie. You know what I'm like by now. I like to prod and poke at you, but actually that's not what I'm going to do at all. But what I did want to do is not just leave that video up there in the ether without any kind of counterpoint to it, to show the things that I think contrast paints are good at. I did say in that video where I compared contrast to traditional paints that whilst I don't think they have any advantages over them in the average usage case, I still think that there are definitely corner cases where contrast paints are a brilliant tool and they're really, really worth owning. So in this video, I'm going to give you 5 examples of workups that I absolutely love and rely on contrast paints. Let's begin. First of all, these paints are absolutely fantastic through the airbrush used as a colour filter. So what this involves doing is kind of just loading up the paint in a similar colour to what you've already laid down. So you'll want to go for something that's a little bit washed out looking as a start. And then as you'll see in this example, when we start spraying our blue contrast paint onto our washed out blue painted dreadnought, we start to bring up the intensity of the whole colour workup. So we can still leave some little bits of that kind of washed out highlight just on the very, very tips of things, but this contrast paint allows us to blend back really, really nicely. And to do this, you're just really thinning it, probably about 2 to 1 with paint thinner, chucking it in your airbrush and treating it just like you treat any other paint or ink. It's very, very simple and easy to use, and it's brilliant for this purpose. I use it all the time like this, especially for my ultramarines. And kind of a divergence from that, something else that I'll do quite often, but it's not exactly the same, is using contrast as a colour filter over a value guide. So a value guide is just a black and grey sketch that tells you the value or the lightness or darkness that you want in your colours. And then over that value guide you can apply contrast paints to get a sort of overall tint to every section of that value guide. So as you can see on this spear tip here, what it ends up giving me is kind of this magical glowing metal sort of look, but it also works really well to use a value guide, for example, with Blood Angels Red to do red fabrics. There's all sorts of different things that you can do with it. So you kind of just lay down this black and grey sketch first and then just carefully paint an even coat of your contrast paint over it. The only thing I would say with using them over a value guide is just be careful not to do it on big, wide, flat areas, because that blotchiness will interfere with the value guide underneath. Next on my list, and this one actually you may well know already, but I feel it's worthy of a mention just because it's such a good one. Games Workshop themselves have started recently using this workup in a lot of their videos. But you take a silver base and then you grab Basilicanum grey contrast paint and you slap it all over. Once that is dry, you can then go back in with a dry brush. I like to use Necron Compound personally because I really like the sort of dusty look that it gives being a dry paint. And what you end up with is just this really nice beaten, aged, worn as fuck silver metal. And I think this is perfect for if you were painting, for example, Iron Warriors. And actually, I might go ahead and paint an Iron Warrior for the channel just because I want to use this and I want to show maybe like a really quick scheme for it. Okay, I think probably the greatest unsung hero of the contrast range is Apothecary White. This paint is brilliant. For years and years and years as a fledgling painter, I struggled to find a reliable way to quickly shade white. And I'll admit that these days, if I'm painting white for a commission, no, I do not use this contrast method, because I do think that a slower, more manual workup gives better overall results in the end. However, if I'm trying to do a battle-ready white, I can use this contrast paint to get something that's way better than any quick method I've ever had previously. It's really, really simple. You just start out base coated in Corax White, you slap your Apothecary White all over the surface and get a nice even coat. You then wait a horrible amount of time for it to dry. That is the one thing, because you're slapping these all over and they're liquid, there is a bit of drying time. But once it's dry, you can then come back in with some very thin down Corax White initially, just to start to blend out and flatten some of those surfaces. And then a nice pure white. In this case, I use Dragon White from Reaper MSP. And you can just kind of poke that towards the tips and edges just to get some nice highlights. And this doesn't take very long at all. It's basically just a base coat, a shade, and a two-stage highlight, and the Apothecary White is acting as a shade. But because of that sort of astringent sort of pooling effect that the Apothecary White has, it just gathers a little bit nicer than a shade does in this application and produces a really kosher, beautiful looking white that I'm really, really into. And finally, this one featured in a video a while back that was quite popular at the time. Contrast paints for doing fire and flame workups are brilliant. The yellows, reds and browns are all very, very good for use in applications where you want transparent paints. So this isn't a pure contrast workup, and you'll see from this footage as it's sort of starting to roll through that there's definitely bits of other paint in there. But essentially this workup is just Avalon Sunset and then a yellow contrast paint over that, and then a red contrast paint thinned down a bit more, just sort of glazed into the shadows, and then a brown contrast paint glazed onto the tips, and then we start to just build back up with some yellows, adding whites to them, and eventually what you get is this really cool kind of forged flaming sword. And I use this workup as well for like normal fire and flames. There's a ton of different applications that this is really good for. It's actually one of my favorites, and it's probably the contrast workup that I most frequently use. So there you have it. I'll have no accusations from any of you that I hate contrast paints and I was just shitting on them. I think contrast paints are brilliant. They are essentially acrylic inks, but they're a little bit more viscous, and that kind of changes some of the technical stuff that you can do with them. Acrylic inks have been a tool that miniature painters have used for a very, very long time, and the introduction of contrast paints into our toolboxes just gives us another option in that same sort of region. They are brilliant. I love using them, and I want to come up with more interesting workups to do for them. So as I do that, I will try and bring you more videos that involve the contrast paints, because apparently it turns out you folks like them too. So if you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, and you can of course subscribe and enable notifications so that you can stay up to date on what I'm doing on the channel. If you would like to support the creation of this content and you like it that much, there's also a Patreon campaign that will be linked in the description, along with all of my social media links. So with all of that said, I appreciate you hearing even more rambling from me about contrast paints. Thank you so much. And I'm going to get myself out of here now. Let's roll the end credits, thank those patrons, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching, everybody.